All right. Well, we are continuing our series on the mission of God for the family. And we've been talking about different uh, ways to think about raising kids, different ways to think about sending your kids off, what their mission is, what God has created them for, so that we can raise them and educate them and towards what it is that God has made them for. We've talked about how God made them to be dragon slayers going out into the wilderness, clearing a space to be able to turn a piece of wilderness into garden. We've talked about how God made them to be treasure hunters, that he filled the land of Havilah with gold and precious gems and said, go get them and transform them, to think in terms of serving your neighbor, adding value to your neighbor's life with your calling. And all of this is in the context of talking about the three spheres of the world that God created when he created the land of Eden with the Garden of Eden in it, and then the wilderness outside, and that our dominion over time as a family is taken in that way. We move from raising our kids in a garden where they're formed into who God created them to be. And then they're trained in the land that God has given us, that we are taking care of, that we are transforming, and then that moves them out into the wilderness so they can take a piece of wilderness, turn it into a garden, raise kids in it, and uh, uh, turn that garden that land and then send their kids out into the wilderness and eventually overtaking the whole world. And now, because of sin, the process is sweatier, it's harder, it's tougher, it's more painful, but it's the same process that God originally called us to. So that part hasn't changed. And but one of the things that is added though is conversion, evangelism, right? We're going to have to go out and tell every creature about the restoration of humanity in Christ, the about the good news of the return to God, the good news of God being the just and the justifier of sinners, the good news of Christ's death and resurrection, the good news of Adam's sin being overcome, the good news of the devil's works being destroyed. All the aspects of the good news we now that's a part of the mission, a part of the transformation of the wilderness. There are people that are now out there amongst the wild animals, and uh, or the but the restoration of their humanity is a possibility because Christ, the perfect man, who was also the second person of the triune God, has come and died and been raised from the dead, taking humanity out of the dominion of Satan, of the dragon, and returning it to the dominion of God. So that's now a part of the whole story. But one of the things that's really that gets in the way right now of uh, raising kids just in the modern world and the way that we think and do things is that we don't really believe that people have a nature anymore. Right? The modern philosophies, the dominant philosophies of our day, deny that people have a nature. Right? They are what's called metaphysical nihilists. That the shape that things are in doesn't arise out of what they are, but they're in this particular shape because of the external forces that have been applied that have made them into this shape. So the dominant mythology of our day is Darwinism, and that evolutionary Darwinism using the force of the historical processes, using force in historical processes, has formed us into this shape by means of the external stimuli, external forces that we had to adjust to. So we exist more like we're in this shape for the same reason that a puddle is in the shape that it's in, because of the force that is applied by the shape of the hole around it. We fell into this hole and came out human shaped, because of the force that was applied, the forces around us. Well, that's in philosophical terms, that's called nihilism, metaphysical nihilism. We don't believe we have a nature, and that has affected the way that we think about raising kids. Right? We ask, is it nature or nurture? But by the word nature, what we mean is DNA. Is it because of the historical processes of developing this DNA that my kid is acting this way, or is it external forces? Right? And those are the options. There's never a the metaphysical question is never asked, is what is the nature of this child? What was this child created to be? What are they? And uh, because of that, we forget sometimes that our kids are fallen by nature, right? That they have inherited a sinful nature, that they've inherited a bent humanity, a humanity, and in this case, what that means is that the desires of our kids are not, they don't come out in their proper shape and in their proper form. They don't come out with their nature seeking the right use of what they are, right? They don't come out with a proper connection between what they are and what they're for. They come out with a bent set of desires, right? So kids learn to they don't have to be taught to lie. They know how to lie because their nature teaches them, right? And if that's the case, then that really does affect our parenting because very often um, parents take the sin of their kids personal, thinking because they've got that nihilistic, that evolutionary mindset that this is a nurture issue, right? If it weren't for the way that I did things as a parent, they would turn out just right. That I'm the reason that they're messed up. No, there's a sense in which we're the reason they're messed up because we pass on our sinful natures, or fathers pass their sinful natures on to their children. Uh, that which is why Jesus could be born of a virgin and not have a sinful nature, right? Because his father was directly God, and so he received his unfallen nature from his father, rather than from Adam, right, who passed. All the rest of us have Adam for a father, and so he passed his sinful nature onto us. Well, what you have is um, a child who is going to sin, right? And he's going to come out with bent desires, but the root of the root of sanctification is the transformation of our desires. Augustine calls it the proper ordering of our loves. Right, over time, our sanctification properly reorders our loves to coincide with reality. So we love things the way they ought to be loved, how much they ought to be loved in the order. We love certain things more than others, right? You can love asparagus and you can love your wife, but you should love your wife more than you love asparagus, right? But you can love them both. You just have to love them in the right order. Well, Augustine says sanctification is the proper ordering of our loves. And so it makes sense to ask ourselves, how are desires and loves developed, right? How can I parent with this in mind? And there's a great French, he came to America, who did his work in this. His name is Rene Girard. It's a really good book, secular. Well, I believe the author's Roman Catholic, who wrote a book called Wanting, talking and explaining uh, Rene Girard's uh, just the insight that he found about how we develop our desires, how we develop our wants, uh, and Rene Girard is one of those guys who he was brilliant, a brilliant man. He was raised in atheistic France, and he was out studying literature, studying medieval and ancient literature, and he had noticed this particular pattern of the way that um, the way that a society holds together by choosing a scapegoat, right? That conflict, especially generational conflict, builds in a society to kind of a fever pitch where there's no way out because there's so much conflict in every direction. And then a society in order to survive, turns all of its ire, um, turns its rivalry together onto a particular person, and that person becomes the scapegoat, and then the society kills that person, and then and peace is restored, right? And this is something that we actually you can see lots of examples of the way that this works. And you have this man studying ancient literature, seeing it everywhere, and somebody says, well, you should show us how this works in the Bible, because he had never really read the Bible because he grew up in atheistic France. And so he picked up a Bible and said he was going to show how the Bible fit in with ancient literature. And he realized that the Bible was completely inverted, right? That the Bible completely inverts it. And instead of the Bible offering up other people as scapegoats, it actually reveals the scapegoat mechanism by uh, by God offering himself in the place of the scapegoats in places like Exodus, where God says, I will be on the rock, and then you strike the rock, right? God says, you need a scapegoat, right? It reveals the scapegoat mechanism, but God offers himself in the place of it. Or in Job, where you've got a king that they're trying to scapegoat, and he refuses to be scapegoated, insists on his innocence, and then his innocence reveals the scapegoating mechanism, right? So he ends up becoming a Christian because by reading the Bible in order to show how it's just like all ancient literature, and then he shows that it's not like any ancient literature at all. There's nothing like it in the world. The Bible functions in a way that actually restores society over against the scapegoat mechanism. And in his mind, that scapegoat mechanism was the way society restored itself. And it said, but what he realized is it's actually just a cycle of violence, and that any uh, any society that doesn't have the scriptures is stuck in a cycle of violence until the scriptures come along. And he realized, well, if that's the case, I should actually look and see whether or not this is actually true. And he ends up meeting Jesus, and is a it, it and ends up moving to America, teaching at Stanford. But what's amazing is his insight is that how human beings develop their desires is they look around and see what other people want and think, I should probably want that too, right? And he shows that the way that children develop what they love is by being around their parents and their siblings, and developing a set of desires that mime or reflect their parents. And so that's really good news as parents, is that uh, we don't have we don't Paul, like Paul says, we don't have access to the hearts of our children. Or Paul says he doesn't have access to anyone's heart. He doesn't have a pen of iron, or he doesn't have a pen that writes on hearts, in Second Corinthians. So we don't have direct access to our kids' hearts, but God has set it up in such a way that kids are, as they come into a family, as they're born in or adopted into a family, that they become like the people in their family, right? They take on a family resemblance at the level of what they love, what they desire, right? So the most important thing that you can do for your kids is to be growing in your sanctification, right? Is to be growing in the Lord, because your kids follow along, right? As you grow in the Lord, your kids will follow along, and they'll see your desires transformed, and they'll come along with you, right? That's the promise of God, that he will be a God to our children, means that we can raise our kids by faith. Because the reality is we aren't given access to our kids' hearts directly. We can't actually get in there and mess with them and change them around, right? We aren't that kind of being, and we don't have that kind of relationship. Um, but we can trust that as God is working in us, that by faith we can look to our kids and say, Lord, we pray that you would work in their hearts as well. And when we are raising our kids by works, it produces a lot of fear, right? But perfect love casts out the fear that comes with raising kids, and fear comes from believing that uh, if I do things right, my kids won't sin. Or my kid, if I do things right, my kids will turn out. And then realizing I can't do things right, right? I'm limited in my own sinfulness to not having the ability to just do things right. Um, so then the fear comes with, well, that's what's required of me, but it's not what's required of us in raising our kids. Is faith, is belief in God, right? That God's promises, that God's activity, that God's promise to be a God to our children, that is the at the heart of parenting, um, because it's a covenant relationship, and all covenants are kept by faith, right? Our covenant relationship with God that our kids are brought into can only be kept by faith. There aren't covenants the covenants that God gives are not kept by works. So we can lean on the promises of God and trust that He will be there, and that's why as we're going to be talking a little bit about some ways to build what our children love and want, and uh, but the it's not because they're not going to be sinful, right? Because that's why one of the things we always need to be training our kids and teaching our kids is how to deal with the sinfulness of their own heart, right? How to deal with the fact that our hearts are bent, and they're bent towards sin, and that the spirit's work throughout our life is an unbending process, right? He heats the metal of our heart, and then pounds on it, right? And puts it back into its proper shape. That's the sanctification process. Um, is training our kids how to lean into that, how to be grateful for that, hey, how to embrace the pain of sanctification, or the pain that comes with sanctification. Sometimes moments of sanctification are great joy, but often moments of sanctification are God turning the heat up, and then pounding on the metal, in order to melt off some of the dross, in order to straighten out the desires that we have, and move us away from the desires for sin that we're born with, and that we have, that we inherit, from our first father. So, uh, and I think this is one of the helpful places that when the poets come in, they give us some of the language to do this, and a lot of what I'm talking about here comes from uh, John Milton, where he talks about how the what parenting is, and what raising kids is, and education, and discipleship of kids. He says is repairing the ruins of our first fathers, right? Repairing the ruins that our first fathers left, but the ruin are us. Right. It's not ruins out there in the world, although that is something we get to eventually. It begins by repairing us, by the Spirit repairs us. The Spirit of God repairs us. He applies the work of Christ on the cross, and His work in the resurrection. He applies that to us. That transforms us, transforms our desires, and then we come to reflect Him as a transformer. Right? He transforms us, and then we go out and transform the world. Um, and so, uh, but the most important thing you can do is be leaning into your own sanctification, and growing, right? To really be embracing the sanctifying process, attending the means of grace, as the Catechism puts it, right? The means of grace being attending the preaching of the word, attending the sacraments, attending prayer, uh, just, learning, uh, growing, reading good books, the you know, reading your Bible, those sorts of things. You can attend to those means of grace by faith, knowing that God promises to meet us there, right? And like one sermon rarely changes us, but 500 sermons has an effect, right? Can just consistently being at church for 10 years. I'm not missing church for 10 years. the sermons are going to have an effect in our life. The same with the Lord's Supper, the same with prayer, that it's a long game, um, and uh, and just committing to that and knowing that in the long run that God is, yeah, that we will see ourselves changed by the Spirit, is a major, is centrally important to parenting. Watching our own desires be unbent, is important in leading our children towards unbent desires. All right, have a great day.